Good evening. This is Quintus Curtius, and welcome back to the podcast. And the subject of this podcast is going to be it's up to you to set the record straight. It's up to you to set the record straight. And what I mean by that is it's your job to correct the record. It's your job to manage your own legacy, your own image, your own whatever you want to call it. Because if you don't do it, nobody will. And what prompted me to talk about this subject was I have just finished a very good biography of the baseball player Ty Cobb, a man who in many ways inspired me when I was a kid growing up in some ways. And I'm talking specifically about the biography written by Charles Leerhsen, Leerhsen, I think is how it's spelled. And it's called Ty Cobb, A Terrible Beauty. A Terrible Beauty. And you can find that in all the major book distributors. It's a very famous book. It came out in 2015. Anyway, I listened to it on audiobook, and it was very, very good on many different levels, and I learned a lot. I learned a great deal from it. Not so much just about baseball, because that's what's good about biographies. If you read the right biography that's written well and conveys its subject in a good way, you will learn things not just about that specific subject matter, but about life in general. And for those who don't know, Ty Cobb is considered, or some consider, him to be possibly the greatest baseball player who ever lived. That ranking obviously is disputed by many, but he held a great many records. And he played baseball during the dead ball era mostly. And I think his career was from 1908 to the mid 20s. I think he played ball for 24 years. So I think his years would be from 1908 until the earlier mid 1920s. In any case, this was a guy who was a very, very well known player in his era. He was renowned for stealing bases, for base running, for batting, for playing baseball in a very tactical and strategic way. This was before the era of the big home run, before the Babe Ruth era, where the game changed. See, that's the thing about what I learned about baseball. The game changed a lot over the years. During the dead ball era, during the era when the baseball itself was not as tightly wound or as springy, the object of the game was much different than what it is now. The object was to get on base and to run the bases, to try to steal bases, to rack up runs, and to get hits. Because it wasn't as easy to hit a home run back in that era than it is now, arguably. Okay, just because the ball was not as bouncy, it did not have the rubber and cork core that it later did have. But in any case, Ty Cobb in many ways revolutionized the game. He came from nowhere. He came from a rural background in Georgia, and he had a very pronounced talent for baseball. And he played the game in a very serious way. He was not like a lot of his fellow players in that era. He was not a roughneck or a thug. He was actually someone who was a professional. He studied, he did his research. He was all business. All right. Now he was also very aggressive, and he was also pugnacious. And that quality got him into trouble occasionally. He got into fistfights with people, with both ball players and with there were a few examples of fistfights with the general public. But what's important is, for the purposes of this podcast, is since he died in 1961, there's been this general consensus that he was some sort of ghoul, some absolute monster, that he was a violent and venomous racist, that he was a cheapskate, that everybody hated him, that even that he murdered people, that he spiked other players deliberately, that he sharpened his spikes, all of these legends and myths. And most of this stuff can be traced back to a now discredited biography, quote unquote, or autobiography, written by Al Stump, a sports journalist named Al Stump, right before Cobb died. And Cobb hired this guy to write, to collaborate with him on his autobiography, and the guy just completely, I mean, I don't even, it's hard even to understand the scope of the deception. I mean, the guy outright lied about almost everything. He invented conversations, he invented statements, he invented incidents, he didn't check things. And we're not just talking about mistakes of omission or details. I mean, he literally fabricated entire scenes and incidents out of whole cloth. And Stump had a reputation for doing this, but back in that era, the rules, I think, were not as stringent as they are now for journalists, and he was able to get away with it. And when Cobb saw the proof of the book, he tried to stop publication, but he didn't do as good enough a job of it. And the book was published. And for whatever reason, Cobb's heirs, his sons, daughters, never stepped in to correct any of these misunderstandings or impressions. And the lies just stood. They just stood out there for decades. And only now are we really beginning to understand just the level of the lies. This book by Leerhsen is very good because it starts right at the beginning and it goes through the man's entire life, and it shows just what I think reasonable diligence would have shown, which is that although this guy certainly was no angel, in other words, he was a pugnacious guy, he was a complicated individual, he had his issues, but he was not some sort of venomous, violent racist or murderer or spike sharpener, or he played dirty, or any of this other stuff. These are all total lies. And it really struck me just reading this book and reading oh, by the way, Stump, not only did Stump lie about Cobb in conversations, but he, according to Leerhsen, he even went so far as to forge letters in Cobb's name. Cobb wrote with a trademark green ink. And I guess what he did, he typed Stump, once the market for baseball memorabilia took off in the 70s, I guess he realized that money could be made. So he had in his possession some odds and ends, some trinkets from Cobb. And he just forged letters, apparently, and tried to sell them, pass them off as genuine, which is a felony. I mean, forgery is a felony. So this guy is not just a fabulist. He was literally a criminal. And you say to yourself as you're hearing all this, why in the hell did Cobb ever hire a guy like this to write his autobiography? Why would he have done this? And I think the answer is he didn't know. I don't think he just didn't have the sophistication, or he didn't have the understanding to comprehend the level of malice that a lot of these journalists really have. Again, they want the dramatic story. The truth doesn't matter. It's what sells, what can cause controversy, what can gin up interest. And apparently he thought that people loved a bad guy story, even if it was a lie. So, I could spend hours talking about Cobb, but I don't think that's really the subject of this podcast. The subject that we're really here to talk about is, it's your job to set the record straight. One of the things I learned from this book is, if you don't take charge of your own destiny, if you don't take charge of your own legacy, your own reputation, your own interests, no one is going to do it for you. If the greatest baseball player in the world could not manage his own image through his own, I think, in many ways, his negligence, then the lesson is is hammered home that much more to the rest of us. And looking back, after reading this book, I think the reasons or the contributory factors that enabled all these false myths to get started about Cobb really were several. For the first thing was, I think in some ways he contributed to it by not correcting them with enough stridency during his lifetime. For tactical reasons, Cobb was a chess player, and while he was playing baseball, he liked his opponents to think that he was crazy, even though he was not. It served his interests. It suited his interests for them to think that he was a maniac and a wild man and that he might do something, because that was part of his psychological warfare games. And that's all fine. That's well and good. That's all well and good. That's fine as long as you're playing baseball. But when you retire, that's the time to curate your image and to make sure that lies are addressed and responded to. And he sort of did it, but he didn't do it, I think, with enough intensity. And this was maybe before the real age of the mass media. But he still could have done more. He still could have done more. I think the second mistake that Cobb made was he did not really stay in touch with the sport. Once he retired in the 20s, he kind of drifted off, and he didn't really have much to do with himself. He didn't really know what to do. He spent his time playing golf, hunting, managing his investments, dealing with his family. He had a number of children. And he kind of just slipped into the role of the old codger who liked to just lecture reporters on how the game has declined since he retired and nothing is good as it was when he was playing. And we've all heard this type of individual, and that's fine. To some extent, everybody respects the old time guy. Everyone expects the old time guys to be like that, but he did not. Let's put it this way. Unlike a lot of the modern stars, he did not really transition into sort of an advisory position or a consultant or anything like that could have kept his name around and could have helped him keep his finger on the pulse of what was going on. And the third thing is he did not spend enough time or attention to managing his legacy. When at that time when he retired, he certainly, statistics-wise, he was the greatest player who had ever played. And he should, at the very minimum, have worked with someone who could help write a legitimate biography or autobiography of him. He should have picked this person. He should have met with them. He should have interviewed them. He should have consulted with them. He should have put a little bit more effort into managing his image. Now nowadays, hell, he probably would have set up a library for himself, But in those days, that type of thing really wasn't done, and I get that. So maybe not all of that can be put at Cobb's feet, but it's just hard for me it's hard to believe that he could not have found someone better than Al Stump to write his memoirs when he really came around to doing that. He should have spent some money. He should have hired someone, not someone his publisher told him to use. That was the problem. He used someone that his publisher had recommended. And this guy even before he wrote it, he was known for being a fabulist. He was known for having a problem with the truth, for just inventing stories. So the guy was just a complete and utter scumbag. It's just unbelievable. And for all these accumulation of reasons, a perception was created that just snowballed over and over and over. And even after once the Cobb saw the proof, the manuscript of the book, he sent off a letter to the publisher trying to stop publication, but that's all he did. He did not instruct his executor to take legal action. None of his family did anything to correct this absolutely false image of him. And it's just a real tragedy because it makes me realize, boy, if this happened to this guy just in just in his lifetime. Imagine all these historical figures that we read about that we're told were bad guys and evil guys, and imagine just how how easy it is for the historical record to be gerrymandered like that. So, uh, so that's the lesson learned. That's really what one of the big things I took away from this book is learn from the example of Ty Cobb. Learn from that example. Read about what happened to him. Learn from that example, and you should really understand that in today's world, in this world of social media and the news and everything, if someone lies about you or spreads malicious stories or whatever, or if you're at work, if you have a problem at work and someone accuses you of something or whatever, in any venue or situation, it's your job. It's your job to correct the record. It's your job to make sure the truth gets out because no one else cares except you. And if you just sit there with your sitting on your hands and not doing anything, then you're going to suffer the consequences. Because you know that once Stump's biography was published in '61, the people that tried to come to Cobb's defense when he was dead didn't even do a good job of it. They instead of attacking Stump's stories directly and pointing out that they were based on absolutely nothing, they weren't even researched. They were just complete inventions. They tried to base their defense on, well, let's not speak ill of the dead. It's bad to say it's not good to say bad things about deceased people. Well, that's not effective. That's stupid, because that's almost making it look like it's that the stories are true, but they're objecting to the way that you're talking about them. No, it wasn't that. It was that the stories themselves were false. They were false. And so that's really why I wanted to do a podcast about this subject, because it really hammered home the importance in today's world of managing. You've got to make sure that you're responsible for your own narrative. If you want to have a narrative, it's your job to put your narrative out there. Okay, so there's no excuse for not doing that. No excuse at all. And it's just frightening to see that someone with his ability can just be maligned like that. And you know, this 1994 movie called Cobb with Tommy Lee Jones, which I remember seeing, it was absolute trash, absolute nonsense, complete fantasy from start to finish. And the movie bombed. It stunk. But the very fact that this could even be made with a straight face says a lot about how the persistence of malicious lies can happen. So I think it's something that we should reflect on. It's something we should really reflect on. All right. That will wrap things up here, and I hope you've heard me on this. And until next time, I'm Quintus Curtius. Good night.